When it comes to popular character archetypes, few are as enduring as the Speedster. From Hermes in ancient Greece to Mercury in Rome, from the Flash zipping through Central City to Quicksilver not seeing that coming. Speed has always meant power, urgency, and chaos. Gods, heroes, hedgehogs, you name it. So it was only a matter of time before Hasbro introduced their own take on the archetype into the world of the Transformers. And what we got was BLURR. A character so turbocharged, it was like they threw in a squirrel, a micro machine, and a can of Red Bull into a blender and hit pulse. BLURR could have been a thrill to watch, the life of any party. If only he wasn't as annoying as Growing up, I think everyone knew that kid in the neighborhood. The one who had everything. The kind of kid whose parents didn't believe in the concept of too many toys. For me, it was my older brother's classmate who lived just around the corner. This guy had Transformers. All of them. His room looked like a living, breathing toy catalog. And while invites were rare, every now and then I'd get the call to come over. And let me tell you, it felt like getting a golden ticket to Willy Wonka's factory, if all the candies turned into robots. So on one of those rare visits, my friend was especially excited to show off a new Transformer he'd just gotten. An oddly proportioned, mostly baby blue bot who looked nothing like the Transformers I was used to. Sure, it was the 80s and practically none of the Transformer toys had perfect proportions. But this guy, he had a thick, blocky upper body balanced on stick-thin legs and a big head topped off with this strange fin or antenna that just looked off. Then there was his alt mode, some kind of futuristic vehicle that I couldn't quite place. Was it a car? A rocket? A boat? I had no idea. Try as I might, I just couldn't match my friend's excitement over him. But as underwhelming as that moment felt, that in a nutshell was my very first encounter with the Autobot speedster, BLURR. For those not in the know, BLURR was one of the new Autobot cars introduced in the 1986 Transformers toy line. With the influx of new Autobots that transformed into boomboxes, jets, and walking dragonish space shuttles, the once robust roster of Autobot cars, 18 strong across the previous 2 years, had been trimmed down to just 3. Gone were Hound, Sunstreaker, Trax, Mirage, and in their place came the new guys, Hot Rod, Cup, and BLURR. And honestly, of the 3, I always thought that BLURR was arguably the ugliest, at least to 10-year-old me. As if losing all those familiar faces wasn't jarring enough, the new designs abandoned real-world cars entirely in favor of futuristic, alien-looking vehicles. I mean, okay, Hot Rod still looked pretty cool, but it was still a lot to get used to. That being said, there was a good reason for the shift in aesthetic. These new Autobots weren't just random additions. They were part of a bold, stylistic leap for the brand new full-length Transformers, the movie, set in the far-off future of the year 2005. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back to BLURR. If his name didn't already give it away, his tech spec spells it out. BLURR is the fastest Autobot on land. Period. It even claims he's a close descendant of a thoroughbred Cybertronic racehorse, which 1 implies that Cybertron once had racehorses, and 2 suggests that BLURR possibly evolved from one. I don't know which one of those factoids is more fascinating. His profile also says that in vehicle mode, he can travel faster than the speed of sound, leaving a literal blur in his wake. Back in the day, Blue Streak was considered fast, but BLURR doesn't just outpace him, he literally is a blue streak. Anyway, in the animated movie, BLURR is introduced early on as part of the new core cast we're supposed to instantly embrace, which, let's be honest, is a tall order right after watching fan favorites like Prowl burn up from the inside and Brawn, Ratchet, and Ironhide getting riddled with blaster fire. Still, that being said, BLURR did stand out for 2 big reasons. First, he's animated in a way that reflects his tech specs, constantly in motion, often leaving a blur trail behind him. And second, he talks non-stop, at a pace so fast it borders on annoying. That being said, all credit for BLURR's motor mouth delivery goes to the actor, spokesperson, and singer? John Moschitta Jr., aka Motormouth John Moschitta, John Mosquita, or just the fast-talking guy. Man, I never knew that the guy was a singer. I wonder if AI can give us a rendition of him singing South Park's Kyle's Mom is a Big Fat Bitch. Now, that would be epic. Sorry, I got thrown off. So, Mr. Mashida made a name for himself by talking at breakneck speeds in hundreds of commercials, most famously as the Micro Machines guy. At one point, he even held the Guinness World Record for the world's fastest talker, clocking in at 586 words per minute. So, yeah, as far as voice casting goes, this one was pretty perfect. As for his role in the movie, after showing off his blurry abilities, Blur's mostly just along for the ride, defending Autobot City from Decepticons, wrangling the Dinobots, fighting off some pesky Junkions, and joining the final battle against Unicron. In the third season of the cartoon, set after the movie, Blur stuck around as part of the main Autobot cast, though mostly in the background. Honestly, I can't recall a single episode where he got the spotlight. Maybe John Moshida's rate was just too high to feature him more often. Who knows? Still, Blur remained in the show until the very end, eventually heading to the planet Nebulos in the three-part story, Rebirth, which despite its name, ironically marked the death of the show. In the episode, Blur, Cup, and Hot Rod are partnered up with cybernetically enhanced Nebulans who transform into their new weapons. In Blur's case, he is paired up with the sharpshooting Nebulan Haywire, and with a new partner now literally in hand, Blur raced into the final stretch of the G1 cartoon as a fully fledged Target Master. Proof that even speedsters can benefit from a little backup. And speaking of backup, if you're enjoying this video, I'd really appreciate yours. Give it a like and share it with any fellow fans who might enjoy a fast talking trip down memory lane. And if you haven't already, give my channel a sub so you don't miss out on future episodes. And hey, I'd love to hear from you all. What's your take on Blur? Are you a fan? Let me know in the comments below and tell me your story. Anyway, it's in the comics where Blur gets a little bit more to do, though not so much in the Marvel US run. Still, it's worth noting that he did appear in the Headmasters Limited series, which told a similar story to Rebirth, with a contingent of Autobots led by Fortress Maximus flying off to the planet Nebulos seeking peace. In the story, Blur is sent as a diplomatic envoy to make first contact with the Nebulans, which, if you ask me, seems like a questionable choice. I mean, why send the guy who talks a mile a minute to make a calm and measured first impression? Predictably, it doesn't go well. Blur arrives in the capital city of Karaja to deliver greetings of peace and promptly knocks over a giant globe, sending it crashing into a crowd of Nebulans and inciting panic. He's fired upon and is forced to flee. Turns out, poor Blur was set up. His arm had been hit with a magnetic polarizer by a soldier loyal to Lord Zarak, a Nebulan leader who wanted nothing to do with the Autobots. The polarizer yanked Blur's arm into the structure holding the globe, causing it to topple. From there, the story unfolds as expected. The Decepticons led by Scorponok show up, the good Nebulans team up with the Autobots, Zarak and his forces align with the Decepticons, and thus the Headmasters and later on the Target Masters are born. Over in the UK comics, writer Simon Furman took things further by weaving time travel into the events of the 1986 movie. In his story, Galvatron travels back in time to the year 1986 with a master plan to construct a weapon powerful enough to destroy Unicron in 2005. Blur, along with Hot Rod and Cup, follows Galvatron through the time streams and plays a key role in stopping him. The twist? It's eventually revealed that Blur and company were physically nudged by Unicron himself to follow Galvatron back in time to 1986 to stop his plans. So, good job, Blur! And speaking of good jobs, next up is IDW, which, true to form, gave us a much more fleshed out take on the speedster. While Blur didn't quite become a breakout fan favorite like Swerve or Whirl, he definitely outran his one-note motor mouth portrayal from previous iterations. In IDW's continuity, we first meet Blur before the Great War, or technically, right before it begins. Tensions are rising, unrest is brewing, and none of that matters to Blur, who at the time is the #1 racer on Cybertron. He's a full-blown celebrity, known for dominating the racetracks and partying with the elite at hotspots like his favorite bar, The Circle. Even Bumblebee looked up to him, wishing he could one day be like Blur, and be just as fast. Visually, I would say that this Blur is a major improvement over the G1 design, looking more heroic, especially with a pair of wing-like detailing on the sides of his head. Now, looks aside, as I mentioned earlier, this Blur was definitely not the same frenetic and jittery dude we were familiar with. Instead, we got a cool, composed fellow who was cocky as hell. Like when asked about the brewing political conflict, he famously replied, "I don't watch the news, I am the news." So yeah, pretty much a self-centered a-hole. You know, the type who couldn't even be bothered to remember the names of his own pit crew. Anyway, as expected, Blur's glamorous life comes crashing down when he is left stranded alone in the rundown desert town of Radiator Springs, where he learns the true value of friendship and matures into a true Oh wait, I'm sorry. I was thinking about the story of another cocky, self-centered racer. Blur's reality shifts when his racetrack is bombed and the races are cancelled. Suddenly, the spotlight is gone and his former crew and rivals alike are enlisting and dying. Forced to grow up fast, Blur finds himself courted by both Starscream and a not yet primed Orion Pax to join their respective sides. Eventually, he chooses the Autobots and sticks with them for the entirety of the war, even joining the infamous but legendary Suicide Squad team known as the Wreckers, serving under the grizzled command of Cup. After the war, Blur uncharacteristically slows things down by reopening and running Macadam's old oil house. It becomes the go-to spot for energon and oil and a rare neutral ground where Autobots, Decepticons, and Neutrals can all hang out, as long as they can pay. But despite his new semi-charmed life, Blur still manages to make a significant contribution to the ongoing Cybertronian expansion by winning over the long-lost speed-obsessed colony of Velocitron to join the Council of Worlds after beating them at their own game and winning their Elite Benefit 500 race. With a little help from Windblade, but whatever, a win's a win. Ka-chow! In the end, Blur keeps running his bar until the Planet Eater Unicron arrives. During Cybertron's final moments, Blur performs one last heroic act, saving his patrons from destruction. But even he isn't fast enough to outrun Unicron. As the ground gives way beneath him, the legendary speedster is consumed, bringing his story to a tragic but heroic end. And while that Blur definitely died, another equally popular version of the speedster had a far more ambiguous fate. In the 2007 series Transformers Animated, we got a new but somewhat familiar take on Blur, back to his classic fast-talking hyperactive self, and once again voiced by the legendary John Moschitta Jr., but now serving as a Cybertron Elite Guard intelligence agent assigned to covertly monitor Optimus Prime's crew and Decepticon activity on Earth. During one of his missions, Blur intercepts a critical transmission between Megatron and a double agent on Cybertron. And after a wild battle involving getting trapped in a cement shell with a couple of Starscream clones and accidentally getting sent via space bridge to a planetoid near Saturn, after breaking free from his cemented predicament, Blur does the most Blur thing imaginable. He literally runs back across the galaxy, leaping from asteroid to asteroid to get back to Cybertron and report to his superior what he knows. Unfortunately for Blur, his superior is Long Arm Prime, who turns out to be the double agent as he is actually Shockwave in disguise. Unfortunately, Shockwave isn't about to let that secret slip, and so he manages to trap Blur in a series of remotely sealed maintenance tunnels and ultimately crushes him into a small blue metal cube, which he casually hands off to Cliffjumper for incineration. Blur's fate was left up in the air, especially since the series was cancelled soon after. But according to the late Derek J. Wyatt, the show's lead character designer, the intention was not to kill Blur. In fact, Wyatt even drew his still-beating spark inside the cube in the official animation model. And years later at BotCon 2015, the Transformers animated team performed a special script reading for a story titled The Return of Blur, which, while not officially produced, fans embraced as canon. In the story, Blur's dormant crushed form is discovered by the Autobot ally Sari Sumdak, who uses her residual Allspark energy to reactivate him, and Optimus Prime and Jazz then restore his body using the Allspark Matrix. So yeah, welcome back, Blur. Woohoo! Anyway, knowing that this version of Blur survives is a huge relief because honestly, visually speaking, I think that this is the coolest looking Blur. He's sleeker, pointier, lankier. I mean, I admit the animated aesthetic can be divisive. You either love it or hate it. I belong to the former group, so if you ask me, this one's a major upgrade over the original design. What's even better though is that Hasbro actually nailed the toy version. The way they translated Blur's hyper-stylized screen design into a physical working toy is nothing short of impressive. I mean, yes, you can argue that his shoulders are a bit too much, but I can live with them. And that car mode is just the perfect blend of futuristic with real-world sensibilities. So much personality in my opinion. I also think it's worth mentioning that Blur's design even pays homage to an old unused Transtech concept for Cheetor, which featured the same hollow wheels in the legs. Fittingly, this mold was later retooled into a Transformers Collectors Club exclusive Cheetor figure. Anyway, since we've already drifted into toy talk, let's keep racing through the rest of Blur's plastic incarnations, shall we? After the original G1 toy, which was reissued a year later as a Target Master with his partner Haywire, we had to wait over 2 decades for the next Blur toy. In 2010, Generations Blur hit shelves, loosely based on the IDW Comics version. I say loosely because while he had a brand new IDW-styled head, the toy was basically an extensive retool of Generations Drift, and transformed into a sporty, Earth-based vehicle, sort of a cross between a Nissan Silvia S15 and a Mitsubishi F2O. It didn't really scream Blur, but it worked for me as a what-if version of the Speedster had he gotten an Earth mode. 6 years later, we got the next Blur toy as part of the Titan's Return line, which meant that this Blur was a Headmaster, now partnered with the Titan Master Hyperfire, who transformed into his head. Gimmick aside, I thought that this was a pretty solid take on Blur. Solid enough for me to shell out extra for the Japanese Legends version, which came with a more cartoon-accurate deco. And even more moolah to grab the Legends version of Double Cross just to get the packed-in Target Master Haywire to pair with him. Yeah, I have a problem. Anyway, then in 2020, we got what was supposed to be the ultimate Blur in the Studio Series 86 line. Unfortunately, I don't know, this guy just looks off. I guess you could say his odd proportions match up with the original G1 toy, but yeah, that really doesn't explain his rather wonky looking head. It just does not look right. And given that this is supposed to be the ultimate official retail version of Blur, you'd think Hasbro would do a better job in hiding away those side pontoons on his arms. Anyway, Hasbro tried again 2 years later by retooling this mold into another IDW-styled Blur, complete with a better head sculpt that, I mean, we didn't really need, but hey, accurate Cybertronian mode. Yay! Anyway, in case you didn't notice, all those toys I mentioned were Chug versions of Blur. And while Takara Tomy has yet to release an official masterpiece version of Blur, third-party companies have once again come to the rescue. In 2015, a company called SXS released Overclocking, a solid IDW-inspired Blur which I never picked up, but from what I've seen, it looks like a pretty decent toy, capturing the character pretty well, though it didn't look quite masterpiece scaled. My first official masterpiece version of Blur was 2016's Buzzing from Unique Toys. Anyway, if you ask me, Buzzing is a great option for a masterpiece Blur. I mean, both robot and alt modes are pretty accurate to the G1 look, and the engineering is pretty fun. I do think he's a bit oversized for Blur though. That being said, I really enjoyed this guy, and he would have remained the masterpiece Blur in my collection if I wasn't too much of a fanatic for Fans Toys, who eventually released their take on a masterpiece Blur, aptly called Jabber, in 2019. Now, Jabber fixed my scale issue with Buzzing and looked even more accurate in both modes. The only downside? The transformation is pretty involved. Not terrible, but definitely more complex than Buzzing. And while I do enjoy fiddling with my masterpiece Transformers from time to time, let's be real, as far as I was concerned, Masterpiece Transformers' main role is to basically look pretty on the shelf. So in the end, Jabber took Buzzing's spot in my collection. I mean, given the limited space I have in my house and a finite toy budget, I really can't have multiple versions of every character, can I? Even if that guy is as iconic as Optimus Prime himself. If you want to know which masterpiece version of Prime I eventually settled on and why, you can check out this video over here. Or if you want other Transformers stories, you can check out this playlist over here. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you come back for more.